Well, it's Mothering Sunday, and I hope any mums that are watching have been thoroughly spoilt today. Not been able to get to see my mum, but I'll make up for it as soon as lockdowny things are lifted. And if you forgot it was Mother's Day, it's probably a bit late to do much about it, but if you did forget, send your mum a text now. So I wanted to try and find a story that's a bit mothery themed, and it's tiny text, so it's Grandad reading glasses time. This is a story by the author's just listed as M.S. Waddell, and I think it's Martin Waddell as far as I can tell, who I've done some of his stories as my Sunday story before. And this one's called The Pale Boy. He was a hungry-looking child, the little pale boy. He stood in the corner of the playground on his own and watched the others playing. They didn't want to play with him. His name was Paul. He had it stitched on the sleeve of his grey uniform, just like all the other orphanage children. He wasn't like the others, though, for Paul was beautiful. His hair was flaxen, his eyes were large and solemn, china blue. His voice was soft, and his manner was shy. And the others said he bit them. "What's your name, little boy?" asked the large, overdressed woman with the shiny blonde hair as she bent over him. Paul answered shyly. She sat down on the playground beside him and talked about her home in the country and the cats and dogs and the fields and how he would love the green, green grass. Paul sat patiently listening, his eyes fixed on her appealingly, his two large front teeth showing when he smiled. "Such a nice little boy," said Mrs. Burnell to her husband that night. "But so very pale. I wonder if those children really get the right things to eat." But George Burnell merely grunted. Mrs. Burnell went to see Paul again. In fact, every time she came on a visit to the orphanage, she made a point of going across to the playground seat to talk to the little pale boy. She told him about the fields and the meadows and the stream at the bottom of her garden by the weeping willow tree. And she told him about Trixie, her cat, and the kittens. The little pale boy smiled at her, showing his two front teeth. "How would you like to come and see Trixie's kittens, Paul?" Mrs. Burnell asked. "I'm sure if we asked Matron very nicely, she'd let you come. You could spend the whole weekend at my house and see all the nice things there." The little pale boy put his arm round her neck and reached up to kiss her. It was a curious kiss, and it made her start. His two front teeth seemed to dig into her cheek. "After that, what could I do?" she said to her husband. "The poor little thing was so delighted at the thought of coming away with me." "It will make a bloody mess of the weekend," said George. "You and your fancy ideas, kids running round the place. You'll have the whole orphanage round our doorstep next." Mrs. Burnell rose and left the room in a huff. George was so unsympathetic towards children. "The poor mite," she said to herself, "starved of affection," and she ran her hand almost caressingly over the two tiny scars his teeth had made on her cheek. Mrs. Burnell called for Paul the next day. He was waiting in the matron's office, his little case held tightly between his chubby knees, his face freshly scrubbed and adorned by a cheerful, toothful grin. It did her heart good to see his expectant little face. And George would just have to put up with it for once. "Such a nice little boy," said the matron. "But he hasn't quite settled down here yet, I'm afraid. We're really grateful to you for giving him this little treat. Perhaps you can bring some colour to his cheeks. He's beginning to look quite undernourished." And she laughed, a bleak, official laugh. "Oh, I'm just glad to have him," Mrs. Burnell replied. "Paul and I are old friends now. He always looked so lonely sitting in the playground on his own that I felt I really must do something to try and cheer him up." "Yes, he is a lonely little boy," the matron agreed. "He hasn't really made any friends here yet, I'm afraid. Of course, he hasn't been with us very long, and the circumstances attending his case were, well, tragic. Then it's always difficult for an extra sensitive child like Paul to settle into an institution. He just doesn't seem to hit it off with the others. It's almost as though they were afraid of him for some reason." As she spoke, the matron looked down into Paul's china blue eyes and found the words catching in her throat. Reflected in the little boy's pale eyes was something of pure malice. Something that was there and then lost again as he smiled up at Mrs. Burnell. The matron watched them go, the little boy's hand clasped in that of the fat, florid lady, and as she watched she felt an uncanny sense of release, as though something evil had passed from her. There was something about that little boy. But she had no time to ponder the point. Cecil, Paul's roommate, was waiting for her in the sick room for treatment on the mysterious bites on his legs that the child was unable or unwilling to explain. "This is my little house, dear," said Mrs. Burnell as she opened the front door, and her heart gladdened to see the little flaxen-haired child trotting down the hallway before her, his case tucked under his arm. She took off his coat and then they had tea, crumpets and honey with fizzy lemonade for Paul. He ate sedately, almost as if the food didn't interest him, and he ate very little. "We won't make you a nice fat little boy easily, will we?" said Mrs. Burnell. "I can see why you're pale if this is all you take for nourishment at meal times." Then she took him by the hand and led him down the garden path to see the stream and the weeping willow tree, then along to the tool shed to see Trixie and her kittens. She made him stand by the doorway with his eyes closed, and then she swung the door open wide and stood back. The pale little boy opened his eyes and stood looking in at the cat and the kittens. The boy licked his lips and bent forward to touch the furry little bundles, as a child will, and the next moment Trixie leapt on his arm. The child staggered back under the weight of the assault and fell, the cat scrabbling at his face and his upraised hands. As Mrs. Burnell started forward to separate the pair, Trixie gave a screech of pain and dropped from Paul, running off into the bushes with a strange lopsided action. "Oh, the bad pussycat," Mrs. Burnell made to comfort Paul, wiping the scratches on his face. "Poor Paulie, poor little Paulie." But the child didn't seem to be at all dismayed. "Naughty pussycat," he said cheerfully. "Yes, naughty pussycat to scrab poor Paulie," said Mrs. Burnell, leading him back to the house and paying no attention to Trixie's continued wail from the bushes where she'd hidden herself. The scratches were only little ones, and the little boy didn't seem to be at all put out. Mrs. Burnell washed his hands and face and brushed his hair and put him out to play in the garden while she made her husband's tea. "Gonna play with Trixie?" he said without fear. "Stay away from the pussycat, Paulie," she said. But the little pale boy only smiled at her and ran off happily to search the bushes. She watched him from the bathroom window as he ran round the garden in hot pursuit of something or other. She knew not what. His fat little legs waddling as fast as he could make them. Perhaps she could make George change his mind. "This is Paulie," George, she said to her husband, bringing the little boy to stand before him. Isn't he a little darling? Mr. Burnell looked up at the boy from the report he was studying. A bit on the pale side, he commented. Must be getting food that doesn't suit him at that place. And he dismissed Paul from his mind. The kid would give the wife something to play with for the weekend anyway. She had to have something to play with. But Mrs. Burnell was quite determined this time, and later on she came back to the attack when Paul was safely wrapped up in bed. Wouldn't it be nice to have a little boy of our very own? George replied wearily to her oft-repeated question. It's simply no use starting that old thing up again. But George, dear, Ethel, I'm not going to adopt that child, however pale and frail he may look. I simply cannot afford to have a child hanging round the place interrupting my work. So there it was. Mrs. Burnell left the room in a huff as usual, and George settled down to get on with his work. Mrs. Burnell slowly climbed the stairs to the child's room. She stood by his bedside in the darkness and put out her hand to touch the little quiff of flaxen hair that spilled over his pillow. Poor little Paulie, she said softly. It isn't my fault, Paulie. Really, it isn't. I want you here for always and always. If only George wasn't so stubborn. Then she bent down and kissed his pale little cheek. As she left the room, his two china blue eyes opened wide and gazed after her thoughtfully. I see you've got rid of those blasted kittens at last, Mr. Burnell said the next morning. That's a blessing anyway. We must have that cat doctored. Don't be silly, George. The kittens are in the shed, said Mrs. Burnell. But they weren't. Well now, isn't that strange, said Mrs. Burnell. I suppose Trixie must have moved them somewhere else after the scare with Paulie. Mr. Burnell went back to his gardening. Mrs. Burnell took the pale little boy to church. Coming home, Paulie said, Mummy Burnell, do I have to go back to the orphanage? In a very sad little voice. Poor Mrs. Burnell, that hateful George. Well, at least the child should know the truth. Mummy Burnell would like you to be her little boy for ever and ever, Paulie. But Daddy Burnell is a very busy businessman, and he says little boys make a lot of noise, and he wouldn't be able to work. So you see, I can't let you stay here. But Mummy Burnell will come and see you every week. You'll be able to come here and visit lots and lots and lots of times, I promise. How she hated to say it. How she hated the hungry, betrayed look that came into Paul's eyes. Daddy Burnell doesn't like me, he said in a matter-of-fact manner, looking up at her. And there was nothing she could say. When she reached home, she sent Paul to play in the garden where her husband was working. Perhaps the child could melt his heart. She couldn't bring herself to face her husband now. How could he be so cruel? She took a bath to cheer herself up and went down to make a special going-away tea for her Paulie. She made dozens of neat little sandwiches with the crusts cut off, and she put out a plate of little cream cakes and chocolate biscuits. Then she rang the tea gong. But nobody came. She rang it again, and again, and at last she went out into the garden to look for them. She walked round and round, but the garden seemed to be quite empty. Until suddenly, the little pale boy came flying out of the cover of the weeping willow tree into her arms. "Oh, Paulie," she said, "you did scare me so," and she patted his head. My, you must have been enjoying yourself. Your face is as rosy red as it could be. But Mr. Burnell was nowhere to be seen. He'd quite vanished from the garden, and Paulie didn't seem to know where he'd gone to. Afraid to show his face before the child, was Mrs. Burnell's verdict, and she took Paulie in for his tea. But tea was a disappointment as well. There were all the pretty buns and sandwiches she'd made for Paulie's treat, and he only nibbled at them. Come on, Paulie, do eat up, darling. We want you to keep that nice rosy complexion, Mrs. Burnell said, reflecting what wonders a few good square meals had worked for the child. I'm quite full up, Mummy Burnell. I really am, said Paul. Please may I go out and finish my game in the garden? And of course, she let him go. He quite disappeared until it was almost time to leave for the orphanage, and then appeared at the back door, if anything, rosier and better fed looking than before. They'll be surprised to see you looking so bonny, child, said Mrs. Burnell delightedly, and Paulie smiled his little toothy smile at her. They didn't find Mr. Burnell until about 2 months after his disappearance, when a spaniel went sniffing under the overhanging branches of the willow tree. There was hardly any flesh left on the meatier parts of his body, and the bones appeared to have been gnawed. They don't know how he died, but the theory is that he was attacked by some unknown animal, ravenous for food. Paul lives with his Mummy Burnell now, but seems to be getting pale again. Though he loves his Mummy Burnell, she is a very fleshy lady, and his appetite is growing every day, his little front teeth growing ever sharper. They never found the well-chewed kitten bones. I like that story. It's a bit predictable, but it's kind of fun. And it's suitable for a Sunday story, not too gruesome, not too harrowing. So I hope you're all staying well and safe. I'm going a bit funny here because regular viewers of my YouTube channel will know that the crickets I've got for my arachnid girls are noisy as heck. And I wonder if you've heard them in this video, but it's just constant chirruping, and I just hope they hurry up and eat them soon. In the meantime, stay safe, guys, and I will see you next Sunday for more ghoulish and gruesome tales.